everyone. Thank you very much for attending today's talk. I am Seongjin Jeong, a moderator of this talk. I am a professor of economics at Gyeongsang National University and chief of researcher of social science Korea research team, post-capitalism and the innovation of Marxism, hosting this talk program. I am very pleased to invite Professor Kevin Anderson, the worldly distinguished scholar, as a speaker for today's talk. Kevin Anderson is professor of sociology at University of California, Santa Barbara, with appointments in feminist studies and political science. Kevin wrote many books, including Lenin, Hegel, and Western Marxism. It's published in 1995, and Foucault and the Iranian Revolution is co-authored with Janet Afari, published in 2005. Marx at the Margins, I think it's a representative works of Kevin, published in 2010, which I translated and published in Korean with my friend Jeong last year. And Dialectics of Revolution, Hegel, Marxism, and its critics through a lens of race, class, gender, and colonialism is, I think, is published this year. And Kevin also co-edited many books, including Rosa Luxemburg Reader, 2004, and Dunayevskaya Marcuse Forum Correspondence, published in 2012, and Raya Dunayevskaya's Intersectional Marxism, Race, Class, Gender, and the Dialectics of Liberation, published, I think, this year. And and also Kevin has worked for the new Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe project, new mega project, especially working on volume is section 427, which will cover a significant amount of late Marx notebooks on non-Western and pre-capitalist societies. And politically, Kevin is a long-time and active member of the International Marxist Humanist Organization, abbreviated as IMHO. IMHO is originating from Johnson Press tendency, founded by famous revolutionary Raya Dunayevskaya. And Kevin frequently contributed articles on Marxism, international politics, and radical movements in IMHO website. And for today's program, Kevin will talk about Marx's late writings, theories of revolutionary changes, and of alternatives to capitalism. Kevin will present about 40 minutes. Kevin, welcome, and you have a floor.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be traveling to Korea for the first time in my life. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be there in person, but it's a very nice experience for me, and I'm so happy that my book was translated into Korean by Jeong and other people, and I'm very grateful to that as well. And I was going to give a talk on kind of a general talk about my book, Marx at the Margins, but I decided instead to talk about an aspect of my newest book that I haven't finished writing, but I have some chapters written. And anyway, so that's how I'm going to do it tonight. So the book, I could change this, but right now I have 6 chapters. You can see them there. Well, the title is Mapping the Late Marx on Colonialism, Gender, and Multilinear Concepts of Revolution. And it's kind of an outgrowth of Marx at the Margins, in the sense that I have a chapter on these issues at the end of Marx at the Margins. But this is an entire book devoted to just the last maybe 14 years of Marx's writings, starting with the writings on Ireland in 1869, 70, if you're familiar with those, and then ending with the very late writings of the letters to Vera Zazulich and the writings on Russia that I know a lot of people know about. So those are the chapters, the way I have it set up now. It's dealing with the ethnological notebooks, of course, which are published in many languages for many years. But as Professor Jeong mentioned, I was in the past involved with the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, and so I was involved in the project to publish the notebooks of the late Marx on anthropology, ethnology, non-Western and pre-capitalist societies. And so there's a few notes in there that have never been published. And so I'm including discussion of those in my new book. You'll see, like, for example, chapter 5, Ancient Rome, India, and Russia, 3 agrarian societies in flux. The notes on Rome have never been published in any language. But I think it's interesting to consider that Marx was writing about India at the end of his life. We call it, part of it, the Notes on Indian History sometimes. And then the other part are the notes on Kovalevsky. There's a big, let me put Kovalevsky's name there in the chat. So the notes on Kovalevsky, which has a large part on India. What's very interesting is that if you look at the actual physical notebook, he writes some notes on India, then he'll stop and write some notes on ancient Rome and the agrarian societies of ancient Rome, and Greece a little bit too. And then he goes back to India, then more Rome, then more India. So it's actually in the same physical notebook. He's writing about both of these societies and presumably in a comparative framework. And there's one letter, it's the 1877 letter to the Russian Journal. It's a well-known letter where he says, because they're asking about him about Russia and what's going to happen with Russia if it will become capitalist. And he has this little line where he says, well, ancient Rome had a lot of the features of Russia, ancient Rome went through a lot of changes that maybe looked in some ways like capitalism, but it did not become a capitalist society, nor did it develop a class struggle in the modern capitalist sense, because the working people were divided between slaves on the one hand and free proletarians on the other. So it's just that little line, but that's an indication of his thinking, that he must have been thinking about these societies in comparative fashion. So now we have his notes, and it's unfortunate that the correct scholarly way to proceed is that the mega volume should be published, and then we should have the discussion of it. But the mega volume is taking a very long time. It's in the hands of the mega editors in Berlin. And so I got permission, because I started working on this 20 years ago, and I'm getting old. So I asked them to take pity on me, and I got permission from them that I could quote from this in a book that I intend to write, that I've wanted to write for many years. So I started writing it last year, and I've at least these are the chapters that I've written, and I have to work a lot more on each of them. So anyway, let's go. And then the last chapter is what I'm going to talk about today, which kind of are the concepts of revolution as we think about it after going through all this material, and how we can kind of see Marx's concept of revolution perhaps in a slightly different light, or some additional, maybe not different, but additional aspects to it. So Ireland and Russia are there, but also the Paris Commune. So let's take a look. Let's try to take a look. Okay, so in his last years, and there's different ways of saying when that begins, I'm kind of, after the first edition of Volume 1 of Capital, is the way I'm starting, to 83, 1869 to 83. Marx sketches, we can only say sketch, it's not really a conceptualization, but it's a sketch. These are letters and different scattered writings. He never sits down and writes an essay about what his concept of revolution is. But he sketches several types of revolutionary change, each of them somewhat different from the united working class uprising that forms the conclusion to his major work, Capital. As everybody knows, at the end of the book Capital, in most of the editions, it's chapter 31, and then there's chapter 32, but a lot of people think chapter 31 was really supposed to be the conclusion, and he flipped it around because of the censorship in Germany, so it wouldn't end in a revolutionary way that would be, possibly cause trouble for the publisher. And so anyway, so he writes of a working class revolution. This chapter is called The Historical Tendency of Capitalist Accumulation. He doesn't name the country, but it seems to be a highly developed one, probably Britain at the time, at his own time, which is the only society that fit that kind of description yet. Here's the key passage. Along with the constant decrease in the number of capitalist magnates who usurp and monopolize all the advantage of this process of transformation, the massive misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, and exploitation grows. But with this, there also grows the revolt of the working class, a class constantly increasing in numbers and trained, united, and organized by the very mechanism of the capitalist process of production. So capitalism generates its own negation, the working class. Capitalism creates the working class, also creates a united working class because of the scale of the capitalist enterprises, taking all these former peasants and concentrating them in large groups in a homogeneous situation. So it creates its own negation in that sense. And so you have on the one hand the development of the productive forces, on the other hand a united working class, and both of these developments become incompatible with their capitalist integument. They're seeking to go outside the existing social framework. And so the death knell of capitalist private property sounds, the word private is excised from the French edition for some reason we could speculate about. And so the famous phrase, the expropriators are expropriated, the workers establish a democratic communist system. This is the negation of the negation, an obvious reference to Hegel. Now, it suddenly occurred to me recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, around the time of the anniversary of Capital, Volume 1, that it's not that this is, people there's a lot of debate about whether this is inaccurate. Did Marx, the revolution didn't come very quickly, hasn't ever come in a large industrialized country like he's talking about. But I think one way to think about this is posed at a very abstract level. In other words, there's a capital, there's labor. There are tendencies of society to reduce itself into these two gigantic social classes, but it never actually happened yet in Marx's time or today. And of course, if you're going to have a revolution, when he actually writes about specific revolutions, like the 1848 revolution, he talks a lot about the state. So let's come to that, some of these specific concrete things that he doesn't mention here. So it's a rigorously dialectical and abstract model, but it doesn't deal with race, colonialism, gender, the state, or other factors discussed in some of his other writings, especially his late writings, including many that are unpublished. So it's not that Marx refuses to talk about these issues. He's aware of them at the time he's writing Capital in 1867. It's just that he wants to pose it at a very high level of abstraction. But that isn't the fullness of his theory of revolution. So what are some other aspects? And these he addresses very specifically, much less abstractly, in some of the writings, especially in his last years. So one of them, which is pretty well known, race, class, and nationalism and revolution in Ireland and Europe. And some of this framework is carried over from his writings on the Civil War in the United States and the racial divisions and tensions inside the American the US working class. Sorry. Secondly, the pre-capitalist village commune as a base of resistance to capital in Russia and beyond. Again, somewhat known, the letters to Vera Zazulich, some of the other late writings on Russia. And then finally, very well known, the writings on communism in the Paris Commune and his critique of the Gotha program, where he talks about, he attacks the state, the centralized state, very strongly. So in each case, we could say that Marx revised his earlier views. In 1 and 3, he says so explicitly. In 2, I think we can say that he probably did, although he didn't acknowledge it explicitly. So it's a change of view, but it's also a greater specificity, a greater concreteness. Okay, so let's start with Ireland. The specificity of ethnicity, nationalism, colonialism, and class in the context of a European revolution, because he's interested in Ireland and Irish independence, but in 1869-70, he becomes interested in the relationship of an Irish uprising to a wider European revolution. Now, as he wrote in Capital, in the Accumulation of Capital section, Ireland was the victim of a particularly capitalist form of colonialism, very bitter class conflicts between landlords and peasants. And he even says that this weakens Britain as a world power. And that as a result of the immigration to the United States from Ireland, that Britain is going to be weakened and the United States will be strengthened. And the United States, he already predicts in around 1867, that the United States will surpass Britain as the leading world power. And that's pretty early to say that kind of thing. And of course, the most horrible, brutal example of this was the famine of 1845 to 49, when Ireland lost nearly half its population due to the famine, the resulting disease, and then emigration. So an incredible, the destructive effects of capitalism are just really, really terrible to contemplate. So that's one aspect that he looks at. But what's new in 1867 to 70, and especially 1869 to 70, is that he starts thinking of an Irish revolution based on the peasantry, and then a working class revolution in Britain and maybe France, and how these would intertwine with the issues of colonialism and also what we might call racism. Well, first of all, anti-Irish prejudice weakens and divides the British working classes. He explicitly compares this to the attitudes of poor whites in the United States to blacks, which he had already written for years about dividing the US working class, making it hard for the US to form a serious trade union movement. He says that right in Capital itself. Secondly, the super oppression of the Irish peasant. Super oppression because it's both an economic oppression and a national oppression. It not only starves and exploits people, but it also humiliates and offends their sense of dignity, we might say so. So there could be an agrarian national revolution in Ireland that could spill over into Britain, the center of global capitalism, in conjunction with a revolutionary outbreak on the continent, probably in France. So he's interested in a wider European revolution. He kind of just offhandedly says, well, it'll probably start in France, because so many of the revolutions, I guess, did, but also bring in the English working class. Although revolutionary initiative will probably come from France, England alone can serve as the lever for a serious economic revolution. So that's a key phrase. And he says further, and kind of anticipating some of the things that Trotsky wrote about, the law of uneven and combined development and Russia as a weak link in capitalism. Ireland similarly is a weak link in the British capitalist system, but I think it's a much more complex and interesting framework than Trotsky's framework. So in Britain, as we know, Marx was concerned not only with the industrial capitalists, but also with the landlord classes. Landlord classes were the basis of the army, for example, the officer corps anyway, of the army. So this is another extract from these writings in this period. In the first place, Ireland is the bulwark of English landlordism. If it fell in Ireland, it would fall in England. So many of the English aristocrats have estates in Ireland. If those would be revolutionized by the Irish Revolution, that would seriously weaken their economic and political position back in England, maybe divert resources to try to defend those, military. In Ireland, this is 100 times easier than in England to get an agrarian revolution going, because the economic struggle there is concentrated exclusively on landed property, because this struggle is at the same time national, and because the people there are more revolutionary and angry than in England. Landlordism in Ireland is maintained solely by the English army. The moment the forced union between the two countries ends, the social revolution will immediately break out in Ireland, though in backward forms. So there's huge revolutionary potential in Ireland. There's actually, at the time he's writing, the Fenian movement. There have been many Irish nationalist movements over the years, but this particular one is plebeian. Has a peasant base and includes economic as well as national demands, because they oppose Irish as well as English landlords, for example. And it's kind of a result of the period of the radicalization that occurred after the famine. Another factor is what we would call today the racist attitudes of the English workers toward the Irish sub-proletarians inside Britain, many of whom were famine refugees, because they're going over. One of the places they go to America, but some of them go to Manchester too. As Engels already had observed in 1844 in his great book on the working class in Manchester, he has that chapter on the Irish worker. In the second place, the English bourgeoisie has divided the proletariat into two hostile camps. In all the big industrial centers in England, there's a profound antagonism between the Irish proletarian and the English proletarian. The common English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers wages and the standard of life. He feels national and religious antipathies for him. So, what we could call, in a sense, racism. Marx continues concerning the English worker who is the victim of bourgeois propaganda, including in the mass media. He, the English worker, views the Irish worker, similarly to how the poor whites of the southern states of North America viewed black slaves. This antagonism among the proletarians of England is artificially nourished and kept up by the bourgeoisie. It knows that this split is the true secret of the preservation of its power. And note the racist image of the Irish And note, the features are actually Africanized. It's very similar to the images of Black people in this period. And these are from leading British, I think it's from Punch or one of those leading British magazines. It's not an obscure place. So Marx can take this and turn to his writings a few years earlier on the Civil War in the US. And this is the famous paragraph, at least to people in the US, in Capital, on race and class. In the United States of America, every independent workers' movement was paralyzed as long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor in a white skin cannot emancipate itself where it is branded in a Black skin. However, a new life immediately rose from the death of slavery. The first fruit of the American Civil War was the 8 Hours agitation, which ran from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So, by making that analogy to the former slaves, here, the former Black slaves, this is the analogy. This is what he's referring to. Now, he also said, he states explicitly that these reflections in 1869-70 are a turn, they're an alteration of his thinking. So this is a letter to Engels, but there's a couple other places where he says this as well. Something like this: for a long time, I believed it would be possible to overthrow the Irish regime by English working class ascendancy. I always took this viewpoint in the New York Tribune. Deeper study has now convinced me of the opposite. The English working class will never accomplish anything before it has got rid of Ireland. The lever must be applied in Ireland. This is why the Irish question is so important for the social movement in general. So what's the lever? You apply the revolutionary pressures at the weakest link. The lever, it's just, you can lift it up more easily than if you just push directly. That's the analogy he's using. So we have a complex dialectic of revolution. As I said before, I think it's richer than Trotsky's notion of Russia as the weakest link, let alone the kind of thing with Maoism of, China is the proletarian nation, all of Europe and North America are bourgeois, including the working class and so forth. So if you unpack it and try to schematize it, here's what you end up with. France will probably spark the revolution, but it is too undeveloped economically to win against global capitalism. It's still relatively, it's certainly a capitalist country, but it's not developed anywhere near Britain. The Irish peasants will also step in, challenging both landlordism and colonialism in their independence struggle. This will weaken the position of the British ruling classes, since landlords stand alongside capitalists and their sons dominate the officer corps of the military. The Irish struggle will also, he doesn't say this explicitly, but I think he's implying this, it will shake up the consciousness of the English workers, helping them to overcome some of their prejudice. Because what is the nature of those prejudices? The Irish have a worse material existence than the English workers. As with so typically of immigrant labor, the English workers resent the Irish, accuse them of lowering their wages, being willing to work, being not resisting the bosses and so on. And if they see the Irish overthrowing the landlords in Ireland, they're going to get a different attitude. And that's going to also shake up the consciousness of the Irish workers inside of England too. Thus, both materially and ideologically, the Irish Revolution will be the lever that pries open the wider European one, including on the part of the British working class. It'll open up new possibilities. Okay, so that's the first one. The second ones I'll be briefer with. In his last years, 1877 to 82, Marx refers in letters to Russian revolutionaries and in draft material to communal social forms in Russian villages and the possibility of avoiding capitalism there, especially in the famous letter to Vera Zazulich and the drafts of that letter. Now, this concern about the communal village in Russia is theorized in Marx's last published writing, the new preface co-authored with Engels to the 1882 Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto. So here's the key sentence. If the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West so that the two complement each other, then Russia's peasant communal land ownership may serve as the point of departure for a communist development. Now, we could quarrel over what that last phrase means. Does he mean a communist development in Russia or part of a wider European revolution? I would say that it's the latter, that because the Russian Revolution would become a signal for the proletarian revolution in the West. So he's talking about a European-wide revolutionary outbreak. And these writings on Russia are, of course, just the tip of the iceberg, however, as they were part of a vast project in which Marx made hundreds of thousands of words of notes on anthropological and social history studies of India, Indonesia, North Africa, pre-colonial and colonial Latin America, Russia, ancient Rome, pre-colonial Ireland, medieval Europe, and a variety of pre-literate societies, from the indigenous Native American societies to the Greeks, the Homeric Greeks. And he also looked at physical anthropology and paleontology, geologies, ice ages, less relevant to what I'm discussing here, but it's all in this same set of notes at the end of his life. These are the notebooks which deal also with gender and women's position in society, especially like the parts that Engels took up and wrote the book Origin of the Family about. And we can quarrel with the way Engels did some of that, but Greece, Rome, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And there's in the notes on Rome, I mean, he talks about gender in Rome in the notes on Morgan, in the ethnological notebooks, but he also talks about gender in Rome in some of these other notes that are strictly on Roman social historians. Okay, so again, new notions of revolution. One, resistance on the part of Russia's communal villages to capitalist encroachment could form the point of departure, Ausgangspunkt, for a European revolution if it also involved the Western proletariat. Now, there's a Japanese scholar, Haruki, I'll put his name up there. Some of you may know him because he's in the book in Chenin's. He had an essay in Chenin's book, which has that been translated into Korean? Chenin,
No.
Pardon? Was that ever translated on that book on the late?
No. It's Wada Haruki. Wada.
Yeah, but Chenin's book on the
It has not been published.
Yeah, so people are probably familiar with this. Chenin says that, Wada says, Haruki Wada says that, well, Marx, we're not sure Marx really meant this, that maybe this was the influence of Engels, but I think it really was Marx speaking. I don't think Marx would have, generally when Marx and Engels signed something, Marx wrote it, and Engels was allowed to sign his name. So I think this is, Marx does condition the possibility of communism in a place like Russia on a wider European revolution. Secondly, there are notes on Algeria's communal villages and their resistance to French imperialism. These are notes on Kovalevsky. I didn't put it. These are notes on Kovalevsky's book, The Russian Anthropologist. And so there's a little kind of parallel he draws in those notes, seemingly, between the Paris Commune and the fear of communism there and the attempt to crush it, and then the crushing of the ancient forms of communism found in the agrarian society of Algeria. I did something. Yeah. Thirdly, in the notes on Ireland, Rome, and Native Americans, he frequently takes up the social power of women held in pre-colonial and pre-capitalist societies. While he doesn't state this anywhere explicitly, did he see women's, in some cases, stronger position in some of these pre-capitalist social formations as a locus of resistance to capital? He never says so, but there's a lot of studies about women when he's studying these communal social forms. In his extensive notes on India, he mentions that a communal social structure underlay the uprising led by the Maratha rebel Shivaji against the Mughal Empire and later the British. Well, afterwards, the Marathas kept resisting all the way up until the early 19th century, and that there's a communal social structure underlying it. It's a clan, tribal type structure, but it has communal aspects. Okay. Now, there's no explicit indication of a change of position, though. But we can, if we look back at the 1840s, 50s writings, I think we can see the difference. I explored this at great length in Marx at the margins, but in the 1840s and 50s, he viewed Russia as an utterly reactionary power with no he doesn't mention any possibilities of revolution in Russia. But now Russia could be the starting point of a wider European revolution. This is, I think this is a change. Secondly, in the 1850s, he disparaged Indian society as unchanging and unresisting, certainly in the early 1850s, notoriously seeing British imperialism as offering a degree of progress, albeit in a barbaric, destructive manner. By now, in the 1870s and 80s, he supports resistance to the British and finds positive elements in the communal village structures of India. Whereas in the early days, he viewed it as a foundation of what he called, the category he constantly uses, and he uses it for Russia too, Oriental despotism. That the communal structure actually, rather than being a revolutionary, having a revolutionary possibility, it actually makes these societies even more reactionary. That's his early position, but that has shifted. I would, wait a second. Okay, whoa. Okay. And in those days, the early 1850s, he had little awareness, except occasionally in his writings on Ireland, of the social power held by women in pre-colonial and pre-capitalist societies. So the position of women becomes a stronger and more important issue to him in these societies toward the end of his life. Okay, the third one, which will be very brief on because it's a very well-known one, is Anti-Statist Revolution as part of the anti-capitalist one. In the commodity fetishism section of Capital, which Marx didn't develop in its final form until after the Paris Commune, Marx writes of the dialectical opposite to the distorting lens of commodity fetishism, which hides the actual exploitative relations of labor. Let us finally imagine for a change, he writes, an association of free human beings working with the means of production held in common. Now, as with the statement at the end of the book, there's a discussion of communism, not how to get there, but what communism would look like, but there's no mention of the state. And whether the state needs to be overcome, but there's no mention of there being a state. However, in two other major writings of the 1870s, we can find the notion of destruction of the state. So first of all, Critique of the Gotha Program. Marx famously outlines the two phases of communism, something that continues to spark much discussion, including in Professor Jeong's writings. He attacks relentlessly the Lassallean German socialists and their statist concept of socialism. This is in the critique. The German Workers' Party treats the state rather as an independent entity that possesses its own intellectual, ethical, and libertarian bases. He thinks that's very funny. He also attacks their illusions, a state that is nothing but a police-guarded military despotism embellished with parliamentary forms. Marx's vision of communism does not include a state. And we're doing a new translation. I worked with Peter Hudis and Carol Ludenhoff on this. I co-translated it and annotated it. Peter actually found this one word that had been mistranslated, which is very crucial. Staatswesen is another one he uses. Sorry. Staatsfunktionen, and he uses them as synonyms. Both these refer to the kind of the functions or purposes of the state, some of the purposes of the state, but not the state itself. So in the new society, and people, it's been mistranslated as what form will the state take in the new society? In fact, it's what form will the functions of the state take in the new society, which is different. So we're bringing this out in our new translation. I don't know what the state of the Korean translation is, but this bears on the change in Marxist thinking, I think we could argue. Now, in the Civil War in France, as is much better known, Marx attacks the state as well as capital. The Commune, he writes, it wanted to make individual property a truth by transforming the means of production, land and capital, now chiefly the means of enslaving and exploiting labor, into mere instruments of free and associated labor. But this is communism, impossible communism. We can't quarrel over this translation because Marx wrote it in English. And as I love to tell my German colleagues, did you read it in the original English, or did you only read the German translation of Civil War in France? Because we forget that Marx probably wrote good percentage, maybe a third or more of his writings are in either English or French, including some very crucial ones. A lot of things I've been quoting on Ireland and the letters to the Russians are actually written in French, not German. Okay. Now, the Civil War in France, he highlights the intertwining of capital and the state, the need to destroy both the state and the capital relation, an issue not expressed explicitly anywhere in the book Capital. And here's the famous sentence: but the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. So this is from the Civil War in France. So, as the Commune practiced it according to Marx, a modern social republic of the working class needed to abolish the standing army, the police. Note that we have this thing in America now, abolish the police. As I'm telling my students, Karl Marx actually said this 150 years ago, exactly 150 years ago, that we need to abolish the police and other organs of state repression, substituting a direct proletarian democracy based upon an armed citizens. Thus, it is not abolition of the state in general, for it could be replaced by something reactionary like warlordism, but it's the positive abolition of the state and its replacement by a social republic dominated by a revolutionary working class. Marx thus praises the destruction of the state power, which claimed to be the embodiment of that unity of the nation itself, from which it was but a parasitic excrescence, and writes further that the Commune breaks the modern state power. This formed the basis for the takeover of some factories by workers' committees, a precursor of what would emerge later in the Russian Revolution as Soviet power. But most of the radical communism of the Paris Commune was based on the neighborhoods, not on the workplace. And that had some advantages because, frankly, a lot more women were involved, and women alongside men, whereas the workplace tended to be sex segregated in Russia in 1905 and 1917. Okay, so while the Paris Commune did not abolish capitalism, I think that's very important, it's not a description of communism. Marx writes that its abolition of the state created the political form for such a task of abolishing capitalism. It was essentially a working class government, the product of the struggle of the producing class against the appropriating class, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor. but it wasn't that emancipation fully developed yet. In addition, as is somewhat known, Marx singles out the heroic the real women of Paris who assumed their part in the civil war that surrounded the Commune, also in the administration of the Commune. Okay, now, a year later, Marx indicates that the Commune had caused him to change his position on the state compared to that articulated in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. In their 1872 preface to a new edition of the manifesto, he and Engels wrote of several aspects that had become outdated. One of these outdated features was the revolutionary measures proposed at the end of section 2, which in 1848 included centralization of credit in the hands of the state and centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Referring to the Paris Commune, where the proletariat for the first time held political power, they write, one thing especially was proved by the Commune that, quote, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purpose. That's a quote from the Civil War in France. So this is a kind of a revision or change, if you will. So what do we have here? Three new concepts of revolution that don't exclude what he's saying at the end of Capital, but they enrich it and make it more concrete. Certainly a united working class opposed to the capitalist system would always remain central to Marx. But there are also these three very specific junctures. One, a British workers' revolution sparked by a revolt in France and especially by an agrarian national revolution in Ireland, which would shake up the racialized false consciousness, Marx doesn't use that word, that comes later, of British workers and unite them with their immigrant Irish co-workers. Two, revolution beginning in non-capitalist agrarian societies like Russia with communal village systems, probably also India, North Africa, Latin America, etc. Probably I can't prove this, in my sense is that he's interested in thinking about this more widely than just in Russia, which in resisting capitalist encroachments would also connect to the revolutionary labor movement of Western Europe. And three, revolution that targets and abolishes the modern centralized state with an emancipatory alternative, as in the Paris Commune, as the prerequisite for the abolition of capitalism itself. So thank you very much. And I'm going to end the share so I can see people. Hello again.
Kevin, thank you very much for a really insightful and passionate talk. I think in your talk, you persuasively demonstrated that late Marx constantly tries to revise his post-capitalist vision, learning from the people's struggle in Ireland and Russia and also in Paris Commune. And also you argue that they are late Marx writings are still relevant today. I think your talk is perfectly fits with the theme of our social science Korea research on post-capitalism and the innovation of Marxism, and really helpful for us. Thanks very much again. Now, we open the discussion. This discussion will last about 20 minutes. So all of you can raise your hand and ask question or comment, or you can write your question or comment in the chat window. So we'll start. I see that there is Jeong, my co-translator here. Yeah, so translate your Marx at the margins. And
yeah,
also,
thank you very much.
Marcel Stoetro, who also published a review of your previous book, Marx at the Margins. So maybe they can start, or if you are not prepared.
So Jeong was the other, you're the other translator.
Oh, yes.
Yes, right.
I didn't realize you were so young.
Yes, it's really young, but really it's smart, real, excellent scholar.
Maybe the other one can question first. So 저는 좀 나중에 하겠습니다.
Oh yes.
네.
Then yeah, I will start. Okay. Yeah, I would like to then for make it clear. So. Yeah, Kevin.
Here on the chat. Okay.
Can you see my question? So I'd like to raise a few questions for just clarification. Yeah, I like your book and your argument very much, and I almost totally agree with your argument. It's just for clarification. First, according to your presentation, late Marx's post-capitalist vision seemed to move to the paradigm of the higher form of archaic type of communist property from his original paradigm of the association of free individuals. I think two paradigms are not same. So what do you think is my first question. And second, is there anything you want to revise or update? Yeah, you mentioned a little, but this afternoon, in your Marx at the Margins, published in 2010, based on your decade-long research on Marx and Engels' Gesamtausgabe, which includes late Marx unpublished notes. And third one, I concur your high appreciation of the French edition of Das Kapital as the last and most mature sort of Marx critique of political economy. However, we know that Marx tries to minimize or hide Hegelian terminology in the French edition. So considering that you also argues that Hegel's dialectics is central to Marx and Marxism, I'm wondering what you think of it. So, yeah. They are all.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, let me take it one by one. You said we only have 10 minutes left, is that right?
Oh, yeah, you can have time.
So I have to be very brief then. So, okay, on the first one, I agree with you completely that the association of free individuals has a tension with the archaic type of communist property because, of course, as he says in a lot of places, including chapter 1 of Capital, these early forms of communism lack freedom of the individual. And Marx is certainly interested in that already from his earliest writings. And he doesn't, I don't think, change that. He even accuses Capital of destroying individuality in the workers. So, yeah, there is that tension. I think that's part of why he's interested in this combination of the struggle of the Western European proletariat with these agrarian forms. I don't think he'd ever want, he's not a Maoist in the sense that, avant la lettre, in the sense, I don't think he would want to see that agrarian communism come to power by itself, even if it economically could withstand the pressure of the world market, which it couldn't. But even if it could, it would have some limitations. Secondly, what would I revise in my book? Yeah, I think several things, but I think the most important is that I gave some lectures in China just before I published the book, when I had the final draft, and they were like pressuring me a lot, like, because they're very, they believe a lot in technological progress, more than maybe we jaded Westerners do. So they were like pressuring me, wait a minute, I mean, this these communal social forms, there's no real relevance for today of that. So in the conclusion of the book, I kind of said that the part on racism and Ireland and so forth had a relevance for today. The other part was more for heuristic purposes. But I don't know. I don't think that's true. I think I went too far in that. I think there's places like Bolivia and many where those forms clearly still exist. And I think there was a sentence in Marx, which I should have taken more seriously, that even when people move to the city, it doesn't mean they don't carry with them some of these social relations, even if it's been generations since they were in the city. There's a famous book about Black people. It's not no Marxism in it at all. And she talks about what's basically the communal social structure of poor Black people in the 1970s. Because if in a neighborhood, if someone gets a little money somehow, they have to share it with all the other families around them, because it's like depositing money in a bank. And they get, then when they're in trouble, someone else will give them something. So, and then the final one is the French edition of Capital. I don't know whether he really hid the Hegelian terminology. I'm not convinced of that. And I also want to mention there's a young man from Brazil who's just written a 50-page essay on the French edition of Capital that's going to be published probably in the Marxist Humanist Journal in a month or two. He goes through all the people who've written on it in French, German, and other languages, and addresses the objections, those who tend to minimize the French edition, and there's a lot of original research there with the Marxist correspondence and so forth. Okay, Jinwon Yu Lee wanted to ask a question. Jiwon Yu Lee, sorry.
I cannot. Oh, thank you. Thank you for the rich presentation. I'm very new to your work, so excuse my ignorance if I may make any kind of a unprepared interpretation of your work. But your second point on the communal village and the gendered, the labor and the women's role in revolution in history, how that relates to the earlier points you made, the tendency of homogenizing, the tendency of working class, the industrial working class. Somehow your work can be very useful understanding the current context. Like in the US, most of the militant worker struggles are actually happening in those women concentrated the sectors like teachers, nurses, care workers. So my question is, somehow we need to radically revise Marx's the kind of a logic that the tendency that working class tend to develop into a homogeneous entity. Instead, somehow it creates constantly those fallouts, racialized, gendered, very divided class structure. And where the revolution arises, exactly where the kind of margins of these class formations. So that's how I interpret your work. And I want to know how your work is related to your involvement in Rosa Luxemburg's, right? So you didn't even mention social reproduction sector. Somehow the village forms of labor is where exactly the social reproduction function kind of compensate what the capitalist production continues to exploit, continues to degenerate in some ways.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think all these things are tendencies, like homogenizing tendencies, which then have counter tendencies. And the full homogenization is never reached. It's just a very abstract model of a tendency in capitalism, just like immiseration of the working classes. So, okay, let's take the gender and racial divisions, because we could have said, although he doesn't talk about this that much, we could say that sexism not only divides the working class, but makes the male workers feel superior and ties them more to the capitalists. And so this legitimates the system, because the male workers can say, you know, I'm a man, I make a man's salary, I'm doing pretty well. And that's, of course, parallel to the racism or ethnocentrism that the English workers felt, that he talks about. But because he's a dialectical thinker, and I know this is an abused term, but I have written a little, I have tried for my whole life to understand the dialectic and to read Hegel. I'm not saying I understand it, but I have some understanding of it, I hope. All these categories can be turned around. So yes, it's true that the divisions inside the English working class retard and hold back class development. But it's also true that the special oppression of the Irish workers inside Britain is an additive that under certain conditions can make them more class conscious, more revolutionary. So each of these things cut both ways. Just like, you know, the famous thing in Capital, the reserve army of the unemployed disciplines labor, right? But beyond a certain point, when unemployment gets too high, he already says that in the manifesto, that then it becomes a destabilizing factor. So where's that tipping point? And also when, you know, when these can emerge, and it's always contingent. Your last point, yeah, I mean, capitalism is a parasitic system, and it feeds off anything it can just to, you know, reduce the value that, the part of value that goes to labor. And if it can get away with villages, you know, doing the social reproduction and then having these people appear in the capitalist workplace and then send them back to the village when they're unemployed, capitalism loves that. So yeah, it's always, and of course, Rosa Luxemburg talks about that in Accumulation of Capital. As we know, I mean, I have some differences with her, as we outlined in the introduction to the Rosa Luxemburg reader, but it's nonetheless very important. Okay, and I see should I answer this one by Marcel Stutzler? Yeah, I agree completely. Already in the Grundrisse, Marx says that, you know, free time would be real wealth. So yeah, I think absolutely. Marx's, Stalin's ideal society might have been everyone as a factory worker. Marx, I think, first of all, wants work to be more creative and wants us to have a variety of occupations, fish in the afternoon, philosophize in the evening, and a lot less work, a lot more leisure time. So on both counts, more creative possibilities and also more leisure time. And the aesthetics, yeah, and I think there is an aesthetic dimension, because all human work is creative and aesthetic in a certain sense, just like all human thinking is philosophical in a certain sense. Seongjin, you're muted if you're talking.
Oh, yeah. Marcel? Yeah, I remember that you wrote a very critical review of Marx at the margins. So, but your question is not about, yeah. As far as I remember, that you discussed, you questioned somewhat this nation is more or less is a critic of nationalism. So Kevin's book is stands to relativize the class in favor of the community or the nation. So I think you raised that point in your review. No?
I should have thought of that, and I should have read my review so long ago. I don't remember exactly. I think that what I probably said was that I found the book of tremendous importance, and the issue that I possibly disagreed with was that there is a sense of temporality in it that I wasn't so totally sure about. And what Kevin just now said is actually very similar to what I probably said in the review, that there is a sense that the later positions should rather be seen as slight modifications rather than really a shift. And that in particular, that concerns the question of the individuality or so there was perhaps a sense in the earlier book that perhaps in Marx's thinking, the community, the community concept sort of comes up as an alternative or as a replacement for the earlier conception, which is, if you see it in the sort of in the terminology that was developed by sort of more romanticism influenced German social theorists in the same time, like Tönnies, obviously, that is the famous topos, the community and society binary. So if you see it through those lenses, and for a German in that period, it is almost impossible not to have that kind of these glasses of the binary of community versus society, right? In English, in the English translation, actually, the book is called Community and Association, which is interesting because Marx obviously uses the word association quite often. So I think Marx remains absolutely firmly on the side of association, and hence the expression, the association of free producers or individuals and so on. And I think Marx absolutely sticks to that. So the later arguments I would view as refinements and sort of modifications or additions to that position, but I don't think he abandons it, and I don't think from what Kevin just said he thinks that. But in the 2010 book, maybe there is a way of reading that, and I think that's probably how I read the book when I wrote the review. There's a certain sense that you're suggesting Marx shifts from the one to the other, which I don't think is the case, and I don't actually think you think that either, that there is really a shift. So it is really much more a refinement. And that is obvious, because if you study your life long, it would be, one would hope that you change your position somewhat. No? When we study a lot, we want to learn something new from that. And obviously that's what we would then write about. But that doesn't invalidate the earlier position, which I think remains the same. So Marx would have been horrified by any kind of celebration of archaic community as opposed to society. And I think that is that is probably not really a contentious issue, I guess.
Oh, Marcel, thank you very much for very kind rejoinder. Yes. Yeah, I understand. Kevin, do you have more comments or words? Or
should I respond, or do you want other people to, other people want to say something, or should I respond?
Okay. If yeah. Kevin, thank you very much. It's for great talk, and of course there is no other questions or comments. I'd like to conclude this talk. So if you would like to talk some more or supplement your presentation, you can do that. Or unless, then we conclude this session.
I just have one brief response to Marcel Stutzler.
Okay.
First of all, one of my favorite quotes from Hegel, at least this is the English version: individualism that lets nothing interfere with its universalism. So it's, there's that connection of individual to the universal, but any universal or association has to be individualized. And I think that follows with Marx, because it's an association, but it's an association of free individuals, but it's not the isolated individual of, bourgeois thought. And then, it's always, from time to time, he says, when he goes to Algiers and he's convalescing in 1882, he writes a letter to one of his daughters where he's very admiring of what he can see on the streets of Arab culture. He even talks about the way they walk and carry themselves. It's a little bit Rousseauian. But then he says they'll go to the devil without a revolution. So it's not the preservation of the Russian communal village, but it's the revolutionization of it in the process of struggle that he's interested in. He doesn't have nostalgia for the pre-capitalist world, but nonetheless, he thinks there's elements of that can be aufgehoben, destroyed, but also preserve some aspects of it. And I think that's the way that and those kind of concepts run through his whole life. I would say the generalizations about dialectics and so forth, this doesn't change in his whole life, but the way that he concretizes it or particularizes it does, because I don't want my book to be thought of as, an argument for the case of somebody like Louis Althusser, of an epistemological break in Marx's thought. I don't see it that way, but I do see on specific issues and problems important changes, but not the overall framework of his thinking, which I think is already there in 1844. And maybe that's not agreeing with you, but I thought it might be, but Marcel, but if it's not, anyway. And thank you very much. This is a work in progress, so I'm very happy to hear the comments, and I will think about them before I finish the book. So thank you very much, everybody.
Kevin, thank you very much for your great talk, and we really look forward to your forthcoming book, Mapping the Late Marx. Yeah, I really want to read that book. And thank you also for all of you attending this talk. And our SSK is a Global Marxism online talk continues. So the Thursday we'll also have a talk. So I will really appreciate if all of you could be with us. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.